What if I told you that one boy's life was slipping away, and 100 doctors couldn't save him? That the person who finally stepped in was someone nobody expected. A prisoner. This isn't just a story about medicine or miracles. It's a story about prejudice, courage, and the power of standing up when the world says you don't belong. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe. Noah was slipping away faster than anyone could stop. Machines beeped frantically, alarms screaming through the sterile hospital halls, and every face around him carried the same helpless panic. 100 doctors had tried, 100 hands, 100 minds, and every single one had failed. Every single one. His mother, a Texas police officer, watched from the doorway, heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Sweat ran down her temples, tears blurred her vision, but still she refused to look away. This was her son, her whole world, and the hospital had just handed her a nightmare wrapped in white coats. Noah's small body was frail, fighting a battle it shouldn't have had to face. His lungs rattled, his skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The best doctors in the state shook their heads. Some whispered medical jargon she couldn't understand. Some just looked down, eyes hollow. They had done all they could, or so they said, and then a man appeared, Darius, a prisoner, a name nobody expected to hear in a place like this, much less the one carrying a lifeline. Tall, calm, and carrying a quiet confidence, he walked past security with a single nod. No one protested. Something about the way he moved told you. This wasn't an ordinary man. Darius studied Noah like he could see inside his body, inside his illness, inside the very fight for life itself. He didn't fumble. He didn't hesitate. Every step he took felt deliberate, like he had already been through this battle hundreds of times before. And somehow, just somehow, he made the chaos in the room stop. The beeping, the rushing nurses, the panicked whispers, all of it fell silent when he spoke. Dr. Lewis, one of the most respected physicians in the hospital, frowned. He's a prisoner. He's not allowed here. But even Lewis's voice trembled, betraying the fear he couldn't shake, that Noah might not survive another second. And then Darius leaned over Noah, and something in the room shifted. Not magic, not luck. Something real. Something no one had expected. A skill honed in places most people feared. Brought to life at the exact moment it was needed most. Could a man locked behind bars really save a boy that 100 doctors couldn't? Could this prisoner hold the power to defy every rule, every expectation, every heartbreak stacked against him? In just moments, lives would hang by a thread, and one unlikely hero was about to prove that sometimes hope comes from the most unexpected places. Noah had always been the kind of kid who laughed easily, who noticed the little things, a bird struggling against the wind, a neighbor's smile, the way sunlight hit the classroom windows just right. He lived in a small Texas town, the kind where everybody knew your name, your parents' names, and sometimes even your dog's name. Life wasn't perfect, but it was simple, familiar, safe. His father had passed away years ago, so his mother, Officer Maria Torres, had become his entire world. She worked long shifts, patrolling streets and keeping the town safe, but she always came home with stories, with jokes, with hugs that made him feel invincible. Noah thrived in that bubble of love and security. School wasn't always easy. He wasn't the fastest kid, the smartest or the tallest, but he had friends, and he had a sense of belonging that made every scrape and fall worth it. Outside the walls of home and school, the world was different, of course. Noah noticed it in small ways. A glance that lingered too long, a whisper he overheard in the supermarket, the subtle way some adults hesitated before talking to him. At first, he didn't understand it, chalking it up to misunderstandings or moods. But the tension was there, threaded into everyday life like an invisible weight. At school, he excelled in science, loved to tinker with gadgets, and often stayed late helping teachers set up experiments. Darius, a local mentor and family friend who had a checkered past but unmatched skill in medicine and science, took a particular interest in him. Noah admired Darius, fascinated by his calm confidence. The stories of second chances, and the quiet way he always insisted that knowledge and skill were the truest measure of a person. And yet, even in this nurturing environment, cracks were forming. Noah would sometimes hear adults muttering things that made him flinch, questions about where he really belonged or what people like them should be doing. At first, it was a whisper of discomfort, something he didn't quite notice. But those whispers were the first sparks of a prejudice that would soon storm into his life, challenging everything he thought was safe and fair. Noah's mother worked hard to shield him, to make sure he grew up believing in justice, in fairness, in the idea that the world would reward effort and decency. But outside the bubble of home and the sanctuary of school, society had its own rules, rules often shaped by fear, ignorance, and outdated notions about race and place. And Noah, innocent and bright, was about to collide with a harsh reality he hadn't been prepared for. In this town, life had always been orderly. People knew their neighbors, everyone followed their routines, and the days blended into comforting predictability. But for Noah, the first cracks of injustice were about to appear, subtle, insidious, almost invisible at first. And soon they would grow into a storm he could neither ignore nor escape. Noah's world, once predictable and safe, began to shift in ways that felt almost imperceptible at first. But the changes quickly became impossible to ignore. It started with sideways glances at school, subtle snickers in the hallways when he raised his hand, or the sharp exhale of a teacher who had called on him. The casual whispers of "not like the others" and "he doesn't really belong here" grew louder, more deliberate. And Noah, once confident in his place among friends and teachers, began to feel the edges of doubt creeping into his mind. Then came the first real confrontation. During a school science fair, Noah proudly presented a robotic project he had spent months perfecting. Judges circled, nodding at other students' projects, but when they stopped at his, their tone changed. One judge, a man Noah had seen smiling at other presentations, furrowed his brow and muttered, "Interesting, but maybe a bit ambitious for someone like him." The words stung like ice. Noah's hands trembled, but he refused to cry. He answered every question with precision, explaining circuits and sensors. Yet the judge scribbled notes with a dismissive shake of his head. The award went to someone else, someone less creative, less skilled. He didn't just lose. He was erased. It wasn't an isolated moment. At the grocery store, a cashier avoided eye contact, subtly shifting his basket aside. Neighbors whispered, "He's a good kid, but..." and then let the sentence hang, heavy with unspoken judgment. Even his friends sometimes hesitated, not because they disliked him, but because the world outside the bubble seemed to hum with the quiet hum of expectation. He didn't belong, at least not fully. At home, Noah tried to laugh it off, to pretend it didn't matter. But Maria could see it, the tightness in his shoulders, the sharpness in his words when he spoke too quickly. "I don't understand why people treat me like this," he said one night, voice low and bitter. Maria's heart broke. She had fought her own battles as a cop, facing judgment and prejudice in her uniform, and she had hoped Noah would be spared. But life was proving otherwise. The first major blow came with a scholarship application. Noah had poured every ounce of energy into the essay, detailing his dreams of becoming an engineer, citing Darius's mentorship and the projects they had built together. He received a letter days later. "We regret to inform you." It was vague but unmistakable. Darius, who had taught Noah to see patterns where others saw problems, shook his head quietly when he read it aloud. "Sometimes, Noah, the world doesn't see talent before it sees color." That statement, simple yet devastating, left a mark deeper than any single act of rejection. Noah's pride burned hot, but it also fueled frustration, and slowly, a determination began to grow, a determination to fight not just for recognition, but for dignity. And then came the public humiliation, one that would change everything. During a neighborhood community event, Noah, standing on the stage for a robotics demonstration, was interrupted by a group of local teens. They jeered, threw insults laced with racial slurs, and tried to physically push him off the stage. Some adults stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. His hands shook as his robot toppled, circuits sparking, lights flickering. Tears of anger and humiliation burned in his eyes, but he refused to step back. At that exact moment, Darius appeared. calm, imposing, unafraid. The crowd's whispers shifted into uneasy silence. No one expected him, the man whose past was behind bars, to be here now, standing between Noah and the chaos. And in that tense moment, with adrenaline surging and eyes locked on him, Darius didn't just defend Noah. He made a statement. "Step back," Darius said. One voice rose to challenge him. A laugh, a sneer, but Darius's presence alone demanded pause. The scene froze, every heartbeat amplified. Noah realized that this wasn't just about a science project anymore. It was about survival, about recognition, about defying a world that had told him again and again that he wasn't enough. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. The teens retreated, but the humiliation lingered, searing like fire. Noah's resolve hardened, and Darius, his mentor and unlikely protector, knew that bigger battles were coming, battles that would test not just Noah's skill or courage, but the very limits of justice in a world stacked against them. Could Noah rise above this relentless tide of prejudice? Could a boy, guided by a mentor society had cast aside, prove that talent, bravery, and humanity could outweigh systemic cruelty? Every victory so far had been small. Every setback had been crushing. And yet, the real challenge, the one that would push them both to the edge, was still waiting. The tension that had gripped Noah and his mother, the relentless barrage of injustice and humiliation, finally began to give way, but not quietly. The aftermath of what had happened left its mark on every aspect of their lives, both subtle and profound. Noah, who had once walked the hallways of his school with tentative confidence, now carried himself differently. There was a new weight in his step, a recognition that the world was not always fair, but also a spark of defiance that no whisper of prejudice could extinguish. The community, having witnessed the escalation of harassment and public humiliation, began to stir. Some neighbors who had remained silent started to speak, quietly at first, then with more conviction. Parents began questioning their own assumptions. Teachers reviewed their biases, and slowly, the subtle ecosystem of judgment and discrimination started to crack. Darius, the black prisoner who had defied expectations and risked everything to stand for Noah, became a symbol, not just of defiance, but of the hidden reservoirs of talent, wisdom, and courage that society often overlooks. Noah's mother, Officer Maria Torres, had always been a figure of authority and justice in the town, but now she found herself confronting a more personal battle. She worked with local officials to ensure accountability, not just for those who had targeted her son, but for the systems that had allowed such prejudice to fester unchecked. Hospital administrators, educators, and civic leaders had to face uncomfortable truths about their own biases and the silent complicity that allowed systemic injustice to persist. For Maria, the fight was no longer abstract. It was deeply personal, and every victory mattered. Noah himself underwent a transformation that was both painful and empowering. The boy who had once recoiled at whispers and sideways glances began to speak up. In classrooms, at community events, and even online, he shared his experiences, exposing the hidden weight of everyday prejudice and the cumulative damage it caused. His words resonated with other students who had felt invisible or marginalized, creating a ripple effect that spread far beyond the small Texas town. Darius, meanwhile, returned to his life within the prison system, but he did so with a newfound recognition from the world outside. People began to see him not as a prisoner defined by mistakes of the past, but as a man whose skill, courage, and moral clarity had saved a life and challenged a community's complacency. Media outlets covered the story, and while some narratives were quick to sensationalize, the essence remained clear. Bravery and competence know no color, no background, no label. There were moments of quiet reflection, too. Noah sat at his desk one evening, flipping through notes from his science projects, reminders of dreams almost lost to doubt and systemic bias. He thought about every time he had been underestimated, dismissed, or humiliated, and for the first time, he understood the power of persistence. "They can try to tell me who I am," he whispered to himself, "but I will define that for them." The resolve in his voice was unmistakable, a seed that would grow into lifelong courage. The town itself began to change, slowly but perceptibly. Schools implemented diversity and inclusion programs, local leaders organized community dialogues, and workshops about bias and systemic prejudice became part of the curriculum. Neighbors who had once turned away from conflict learned to confront uncomfortable truths and to hold one another accountable. Families discussed race, privilege, and justice at their dinner tables, and conversations that were once hushed now had a space in the open. Yet the lessons extended beyond policy and procedures. On a human level, the story of Noah and Darius reminded the town, and anyone who heard it, that racism is not just an abstract concept or a distant headline. It is personal. It is painful. It isolates, diminishes, and wounds. But it can be confronted. It can be challenged. And when courage, knowledge, and moral integrity align, the consequences of prejudice can be reversed, and healing can begin. For Noah, the journey left permanent marks, but also permanent growth. He learned that injustice can come from unexpected places, even from those entrusted with authority, but he also learned that allies can appear in the most unexpected forms. Darius had risked everything to save him, and in doing so taught him that true courage is about action, not words, about integrity, not appearances, about the willingness to step forward when others step back. The community, now more aware, more accountable, and more compassionate, had begun to heal in subtle, everyday ways. Children played together without invisible boundaries drawn by assumptions. Teachers approached every student with renewed care, and families discussed the realities of bias openly rather than letting silence dictate understanding. The ripple effect of courage and integrity, of refusing to remain silent in the face of racism, had taken hold. And though the fight against prejudice would never be fully over, because no society is free from bias entirely, the story left a clear, indelible message. Racism destroys families, weakens communities, and stifles potential. But courage, unity, and the willingness to stand for justice can defeat hate, bridge divides, and create a lasting impact far beyond any one individual. As the sun set over the town, Noah stood beside his mother outside their home, looking out at the streets he had once navigated with quiet caution. The memory of humiliation, the sting of whispered slurs, and the shadow of systemic injustice still lingered, but so did hope, strength, and a commitment to never let silence or fear dictate the worth of a life. In the end, it wasn't just a story of survival, it was a story of triumph. A story that reminded everyone that prejudice can be challenged, that courage matters more than circumstance, and that unity and empathy can rebuild what hatred tries to destroy. Noah had survived. Yes, but more than that, he had grown, and in growing, he had changed the world around him.